It was a cold, foggy night when Emily arrived at Green Manor. The old mansion stood atop a hill, its silhouette illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning in the distance. The sound of gravel crunching under her boots echoed as she approached the heavy oak doors. She took a deep breath and knocked. The door creaked open, revealing Mr. Benson, the manor's elderly butler. He had a grave expression on his face, his eyes weary yet alert. "Detective Emily, thank you for coming," he said, his voice low. "We've been waiting for you." Emily stepped inside, instantly enveloped by the scent of aged wood and faint traces of lavender. The grand entry hall was dimly lit, with an ornate chandelier swaying gently from the draft. Shadows danced on the walls as the storm outside intensified. "What's the situation, Mr. Benson?" Emily asked, pulling off her coat and shaking off the rain. "It's the necklace," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Lady Green's family heirloom had vanished last night during the storm. We've searched everywhere, but there's no trace of it." Emily furrowed her brow. "Who was in the house when it disappeared?" Mr. Benson hesitated, then gestured for her to follow. "Please, come to the parlor. I'll explain everything." As they walked down the long corridor, Emily couldn't help but notice the portraits lining the walls. Each face seemed to watch her, their eyes almost alive under the flickering candlelight. The air was heavy, as if the house itself carried the weight of its history. In the parlor, 3 figures awaited her. Mr. Benson introduced them one by one. "This is Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper," he said, motioning to a stern-looking woman in her 50s. She nodded curtly, but avoided Emily's gaze. "And these are our 2 guests, Mr. Miller, a businessman visiting on family matters, and Clara, an artist staying here for inspiration." Mr. Miller, a tall man with graying hair, offered a polite smile. Clara, in contrast, barely acknowledged Emily, her eyes fixated on the window as if she were lost in thought. Emily took a seat, pulling out her notepad. "All right," she began, her voice steady. "Let's start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what happened last night." Emily set her notepad down and rose from the armchair. "Let's start with the room where the necklace was last seen," she said, her tone brisk yet composed. Mr. Benson nodded and led the way down another dim corridor. The flickering candles along the walls created shifting shadows, and Emily's sharp eyes scanned every corner as they walked. They arrived at the main room, a grand space dominated by a large mahogany table in the center. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a roaring fireplace cast a warm glow. Despite the elegance, the room had a slightly disheveled air, as though it had been hastily searched. Mr. Benson pointed to the table. "The necklace was placed here yesterday evening," he explained. "Lady Green wanted it displayed for her upcoming gala. But when I checked after the storm passed, it was gone." Emily approached the table and studied the area. "Was anyone in here after dinner?" The butler hesitated, then replied, "I don't believe so. Everyone had retired to their rooms, as far as I know." Emily crouched by the table, her gaze narrowing as she noticed something unusual. A fine layer of dust covered most of the table's surface, but one area near the edge was conspicuously clean. She pointed it out. "This spot, it's where the necklace was, right?" "Yes," Mr. Benson confirmed. She then noticed faint marks on the wooden floor near the table, barely visible. but unmistakable. They were wet footprints, leading toward the room's far door. Emily followed the trail until it disappeared near the threshold. "Did anyone enter this room during the storm?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. The butler shook his head. "Not that I saw. But the storm was loud, and the wind rattled the windows. It would have been easy to miss." Emily straightened, her mind racing. "The footprints are fresh, meaning someone came in here while the rain was still heavy. Do you remember hearing anything unusual?" Mr. Benson looked thoughtful. "Now that you mention it, I did hear something. A faint noise like something being dragged around midnight. But I dismissed it, thinking it was the wind." Emily nodded. "Let's keep that in mind. Now, let's check the surrounding areas." As she examined the rest of the room, Emily's attention was drawn to the mantelpiece above the fireplace. A picture frame lay on its side, as if it had been knocked over. She picked it up, inspecting its surface. "This looks recent," she murmured. "Strange," Mr. Benson muttered. "That frame hasn't been touched in years." Emily frowned, placing the frame back carefully. "This might be unrelated, but it's worth noting." As they turned to leave, a faint metallic glint caught Emily's eye beneath a nearby armchair. She crouched down and retrieved a small object, a tiny fragment of a chain. "Mr. Benson, could this be part of the necklace?" she asked, holding it up. The butler's eyes widened. "It certainly looks like it. But how did it end up there?" Emily pocketed the fragment, her mind already forming questions. "We're getting closer," she said, her voice firm. "Next, I need to talk to everyone who was in the house last night." Emily returned to the parlor, where the three suspects sat in a strained silence. She took a deep breath, her notepad in hand, and decided to begin with the housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle. "Mrs. Doyle," Emily started, her voice calm but firm. "I understand you've worked here for several years. Can you tell me where you were around midnight last night?" Mrs. Doyle adjusted her glasses and straightened her posture. "I was in my room, detective," she replied, her tone sharp. "After finishing my evening duties, I went to bed early. The storm was dreadful, and I had no reason to wander about." Emily jotted down a few notes, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Doyle's face. "Did you hear or see anything unusual?" The housekeeper hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking her head. "No, nothing unusual. I was asleep." "Very well," Emily said, her tone neutral. "But if you remember anything, no matter how small, it could help the investigation." Next, she turned to Mr. Miller, the businessman. He was already leaning forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Mr. Miller," Emily began, "what brought you to Green Manor?" "I'm a distant relative of Lady Green," he explained, his voice steady but low. "I came here to discuss some family matters and perhaps to purchase one of her antiques for my collection." Emily nodded. "And where were you at midnight?" "I was in my room, reading," Mr. Miller said quickly. "I stayed there the entire night. The storm made it impossible to sleep." "Did you hear anything unusual during that time?" Emily pressed. He frowned, as if trying to recall. "I might have heard some footsteps in the hallway, but I assumed it was one of the staff." Emily scribbled his statement down. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I may need to follow up later." Finally, Emily turned her attention to Clara, the artist. The young woman was staring at her hands, her expression distant. "Clara," Emily said softly, "you've been very quiet. Can you tell me why you're staying at Green Manor?" Clara lifted her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came here for inspiration. The manor's history and atmosphere are perfect for my work." Emily nodded encouragingly. "And where were you last night around midnight?" "I couldn't sleep," Clara admitted. "I went downstairs to the library to sketch. The storm was so loud, and I thought drawing might calm my nerves." Emily leaned forward slightly. "Did you see or hear anything unusual while you were there?" Clara hesitated, her brow furrowing. "I thought I saw someone in the garden. It was just a shadow moving between the trees. But with the rain and the darkness, I couldn't tell who it was." Emily's pen paused. "The garden, you say? Did you go outside to check?" "No," Clara said quickly, shaking her head. "I stayed inside. I was too frightened to go out in the storm." Emily closed her notebook with a small snap. "Thank you, Clara. You've been helpful." She glanced around the room, her mind racing. As Emily left the parlor, Mr. Benson appeared in the hallway, his face pale. "Detective," he whispered urgently, "I've just remembered something. Around midnight, I thought I saw a light flickering in the garden. I assumed it was the storm playing tricks on me. But now," Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Mr. Benson. I'll need to investigate the garden next." Emily stepped out into the garden, pulling her coat tightly around her as the wind carried the lingering chill of last night's storm. The air smelled of wet earth and rain-soaked leaves. She switched on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as she scanned the area. The garden stretched out in intricate patterns of hedges, flowers, and statues. In the dim light, the towering trees and twisting vines gave the place an eerie quality. Emily's eyes darted across the ground, searching for anything out of place. As she moved toward the fountain at the center of the garden, something caught her eye. Near the edge of a hedge, a piece of fabric was snagged on a branch. It fluttered weakly in the breeze. She knelt down and examined it closely. The fabric was dark blue, and its texture suggested it came from a fine garment, perhaps a scarf or a coat. Carefully, Emily freed it from the branch and placed it in a small evidence bag. "Whoever was out here left this behind," she murmured to herself. She stood and looked around, her flashlight beam sweeping the area. A few feet away, near the fountain's base, the light reflected off something metallic. Emily walked over and bent down to pick it up. It was a small, delicate chain link, possibly part of the missing necklace. "Interesting," she muttered, holding the fragment up to the light. The chain was damp, and the mud around it suggested it had been there since the storm. As she continued her search, she noticed faint impressions in the soft ground. They looked like footprints, though the rain had blurred their edges. The trail led toward the garden's back gate, which was slightly ajar. Emily frowned, stepping closer to inspect it. She pushed the gate open, its rusty hinges creaking loudly. Beyond it lay a narrow path that disappeared into the woods. Emily hesitated, unsure if she should venture further alone. Returning to the garden, she retraced her steps, piecing together what she had found so far: the fabric, the chain link, the footprints, and the open gate. It painted a picture, albeit an incomplete one. Emily headed back to the manor, where Mr. Benson was waiting anxiously by the door. "Did you find anything, detective?" he asked, his hands wringing nervously. "I found a few clues," Emily replied, holding up the evidence bag with the fabric. "This was caught on a hedge near the fountain. And I found a fragment of what looks like the necklace's chain." Mr. Benson's eyes widened. "Could it belong to one of the guests?" "It's possible," Emily said, her voice thoughtful. "I'll need to compare this fabric to their clothing. And the footprints, someone was definitely out in the garden during the storm." She paused, then added, "There's something else. The back gate was open. It seems whoever was in the garden might have left that way." Mr. Benson looked alarmed. "You think the thief escaped?" Emily shook her head. "Not necessarily. They might have intended to, but the storm could have driven them back inside. Either way, we're getting closer to the truth." As Emily handed the evidence over to Mr. Benson for safekeeping, her mind churned with possibilities. The garden had provided valuable clues, but questions still lingered. Who had been out there? And why? One thing was certain: the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. The next morning, Emily gathered everyone in the Manor's parlor. The tension in the room was palpable, the storm from the previous night replaced by a heavy silence. Mr. Benson stood nervously near the doorway, while Mrs. Doyle, Mr. Miller, and Clara sat in a row, their eyes darting anxiously toward Emily. She began by placing the evidence on the table: the piece of fabric, the chain link, and a sketch of the footprints she had found. "Last night, I discovered these clues in the garden," Emily announced. "A fragment of the missing necklace, a torn piece of fabric, and a trail of footprints leading to the back gate." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "Someone here was in the garden during the storm. The question is, why?" Clara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze dropping to her lap. Emily took note of her unease, but turned first to Mrs. Doyle. "Mrs. Doyle," Emily said, her tone steady, "this fabric seems to match the scarf you're wearing now. Care to explain how it ended up in the garden?" Mrs. Doyle's face flushed, and she gripped the edges of her scarf. I have no idea how that could have happened," she stammered. "I never went into the garden. I stayed in my room the entire night." Emily raised an eyebrow. "The fabric was caught on a hedge near the fountain. It's a very specific location, Mrs. Doyle." The housekeeper shook her head vehemently. "I swear, detective, I don't know anything about it." Emily let the statement hang in the air before turning to Clara. "Clara," Emily said, her voice soft but probing, "last night you mentioned seeing someone in the garden. Are you certain it wasn't you out there?" Clara's head shot up, her expression indignant. "I told you, detective. I stayed inside. I was in the library sketching. And yet," Emily continued, "your shoes are still damp this morning. They've been cleaned, but the soles show signs of mud. Were you perhaps looking for inspiration in the storm?" Clara opened her mouth to respond, but quickly closed it, her hands clenching into fists. Before Emily could press further, Mr. Miller interjected. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising. "We're wasting time pointing fingers while the real thief could be long gone." Emily's gaze snapped to him. "You're very defensive, Mr. Miller," she remarked. "Why is that?" He leaned back, his expression tight. "Because this entire situation is ridiculous. I had no reason to take the necklace. didn't you?" Emily asked, tilting her head. "You're a collector of rare items, by your own admission. What better addition to your collection than a priceless family heirloom?" Mr. Miller stood abruptly. "I came here to discuss business with Lady Green, not to steal from her." Emily stayed calm, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "You also mentioned hearing footsteps last night. Could it be that you were the one making them?" The room fell silent as Mr. Miller sat back down, his face pale. Emily turned to Mr. Benson. "Mr. Benson, you mentioned seeing a light in the garden. Can you recall anything else unusual?" The butler hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Now that I think about it, I did hear the back gate creak open," he said. "But it closed again shortly after." Emily folded her arms, the pieces finally clicking into place. The thief likely intended to escape through the gate, but was deterred by the storm. They must have returned to the house and hidden the necklace somewhere safe. She glanced at each person in turn, her eyes sharp. "So, here's my theory. The necklace wasn't stolen for profit, but as a desperate act. Someone here panicked and acted impulsively. Suddenly, Clara stood, tears welling in her eyes. "All right, fine," she cried. "It was me. I took the necklace." Gasps echoed around the room. Emily stepped forward, her voice calm. "Why, Clara." Clara wiped her face, her hands trembling. "I needed the money. My career is failing, and I thought if I could sell the necklace, I could start over." Emily nodded slowly. "And where is the necklace now?" Clara hesitated, then pulled a small pouch from her pocket. She opened it, revealing the sparkling necklace inside. Emily took it, examining it carefully before handing it to Mr. Benson. "Thank you for your honesty, Clara," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "But theft isn't the answer. Lady Green will need to decide how to handle this matter." Clara sank back into her seat, defeated. The room was silent, save for the soft ticking of the parlor clock. Emily addressed the group one last time. "The mystery is solved, but let this be a lesson. Secrets always find their way to the surface." The parlor remained silent after Clara's confession. The air was heavy with a mix of relief and tension. Mr. Benson took the necklace carefully, his hands trembling as he placed it into a velvet-lined box. "Thank you, Detective," he said softly, his voice carrying a mix of gratitude and sadness. "This necklace has been part of Lady Green's family for generations. Losing it would have been devastating." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. She turned to Clara, who sat with her head bowed. "Clara, I appreciate your honesty, but this situation could have ended very differently. It's fortunate that we found the necklace before things escalated further." Clara looked up, her eyes red from tears. "I know," she whispered. "I'm sorry for what I've done. I didn't know what else to do." Emily softened her tone. "Desperation makes us act in ways we never thought possible. But remember, there are always better choices." She paused before addressing the group. "Now, it's up to Lady Green to decide how to proceed. My job here is done." As Emily prepared to leave, Mrs. Doyle approached her, wringing her hands nervously. "Detective," she said quietly, "thank you for handling this matter with such care. The truth can be painful, but it's necessary." Emily offered a small smile. "The truth often is," but it also brings clarity and closure. She turned back to the room, her gaze lingering on each of the suspects. I hope all of you take something valuable from this experience. Whether it's a lesson in trust, honesty, or self-reflection, these moments shape who we are. With that, Emily stepped out into the crisp morning air. The storm had cleared, leaving the garden glistening under the soft sunlight. The scent of rain and fresh grass filled the air as she walked toward her car. As she opened the door, she glanced back at Green Manor. Its towering silhouette seemed less foreboding now, the secrets it held finally unearthed. Emily started the engine and drove away, her mind already shifting to the next case. Every mystery brought its challenges, but solving them always left her with a renewed sense of purpose. For now, though, the mystery of Green Manor was solved, and justice, in its own way, had been served.